My sibling secretly turned my parents against me, and I didn't realize it until I was almost cut out of the family. For most of my life, I thought my parents and I had a strong relationship. We weren't perfect, but we were close. We talked often, celebrated milestones together, and supported each other through difficult times. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. Phone calls became shorter. Family invitations stopped coming. Conversations felt cold and strangely formal. At first, I blamed adulthood. People get busy, relationships change. But when my own mother accused me of saying something I had never said, I realized something much bigger was happening behind the scenes. Someone was rewriting my story while I wasn't in the room, and the person doing it was someone I trusted completely. Growing up, my younger sister Natalie and I were never the kind of siblings who constantly fought. We weren't inseparable best friends either. We existed, somewhere in the middle, close enough to support each other, different enough to have separate lives. Natalie was charming, the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave. With 10 new friends, I was quieter, more reserved, preferred small groups and meaningful conversations. Our parents often joked that we balanced each other out. For years, that seemed true. As adults, our relationship remained relatively stable. We lived in different cities but stayed in touch. We attended holidays together, shared family birthdays, called occasionally. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. Someone had told me back then that Natalie would become the biggest source of conflict in my life. I would have laughed. The problems started so gradually that I almost missed them. Looking back, the first sign appeared shortly after my 30th birthday. My parents forgot to call. That had never happened before, not once. Mother always called first thing in the morning, every year, without fail. This time, the entire day passed without a single message. Around 8 that evening, I finally called her. She sounded surprised to hear from me. Not guilty, surprised. Everything okay? She asked. I laughed. Just checking in. There was a brief pause. Then she said something strange. Oh, I figured you'd be busy celebrating with friends. I frowned. What? Another pause. Natalie said you had plans all day. The comment felt odd but harmless. I didn't think much about it until later. A few weeks afterward, another small incident happened. My parents hosted a family barbecue. I found out about it from social media. Not from them. Not from a phone call. Not from an invitation. A photo. Stared at the picture in confusion. Several relatives were there. Natalie was there. Even distant cousins had attended. But somehow nobody mentioned it to me. Called my mother afterward. How was the barbecue? She sounded surprised again. You weren't working? My confusion deepened. No. A pause. Then, Natalie told us you couldn't make it. My stomach tightened slightly. That was strange. Very strange. Because nobody had asked me at all. Still, I tried giving Natalie the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she misunderstood something. Maybe there had been confusion. Maybe it wasn't intentional. A few days later, I called her. Hey, did mom ask whether I was free for the barbecue? Natalie laughed lightly. Oh, just one word. Oh. Then she immediately changed the subject. At the time, I let it go. I wish I hadn't, because once I started paying attention, I noticed a pattern. Small things, subtle things, comments. That didn't quite make sense. My father mentioning that he assumed I was too busy for family events. My mother saying she didn't want to bother me because I preferred being independent relatives. Occasionally referencing opinions I supposedly had opinions I had never expressed. Each incident was tiny on its own, not easy to dismiss, easy to explain, but together they formed something uncomfortable. A picture. And I didn't like what that picture looked like, because somehow the version of me my family was describing didn't sound like me at all. It sounded like someone else's interpretation, someone else's narrative. Then came Thanksgiving, the moment everything started unraveling. Every year, our family gathered at my parents' house. It was one of the few traditions everyone consistently maintained. I arrived early, carrying a homemade dessert. The moment I walked through the door, something felt off. The atmosphere was tense, not openly, hostile, just strange. My mother greeted me politely, not warmly, politely. My father barely looked up from the living room. Even some relatives seemed uncomfortable. I immediately sensed I had walked into something. I just didn't know what. For most of the afternoon, conversations felt awkward. People acted normal, but not quite normal, almost like everyone had information I didn't. Eventually, while helping my mother in the kitchen, she said something that made my blood run cold, completely out of nowhere, without warning, without context. She looked at me and said, "I still can't believe you'd say that about your father." I froze. The dish in my hand suddenly felt heavier. What are you talking about? My mother frowned, as if she was confused by my confusion. Then she repeated a sentence I had never spoken in my life, and in that moment, I realized someone had been speaking for me. When my mother repeated the exact quote she believed came from me, I immediately knew where it originated, because only one person in the family had ever been present when that conversation supposedly happened. For a few seconds, I just stared at my mother. The sounds of Thanksgiving carried on around us. Laughter drifted in from the dining room. Someone turned on music in the living room, but inside the kitchen, everything felt strangely still. "What did you just say?" I asked. My mother looked surprised, as if you don't know. I genuinely don't. She set down the dish towel she was holding. Then she repeated it, word for word. According to her, I had told Natalie that our father was controlling, impossible to please, and that I only visited family out of obligation. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, not because the words were insulting, because they were completely fabricated. Had never said anything remotely close to that ever, Mom. My voice came out quieter than I intended. I never said that. Her expression immediately quietly shifted, not convinced, not relieved, skeptical, and that hurt more than I expected. For most of my life, my mother had trusted me. Now she was looking at me like someone trying to decide who was telling the truth. "You don't remember?" she asked carefully. I never said it. A long silence followed. Then she said the one thing I had already begun to fear. "Natalie told us you did." There it was, the name, the source, the person standing directly between me and my parents without me realizing it. I looked away for a moment, trying to process, trying not to react emotionally, because if I reacted too strongly, I knew exactly how it would look: defensive, guilty, desperate. Instead, I took a slow breath. "When did she tell you this?" My mother hesitated. "Several months ago." Several months. My chest tightened. That meant this wasn't a recent misunderstanding. Wasn't a single mistake. It had been sitting there for months, influencing conversations, shaping opinions, changing perceptions, and I hadn't even known it existed. I looked back at my mother. "Did you ask me about it?" Her silence answered before she did. "No." The word landed heavily between us. No. No conversation. No clarification. No opportunity to defend myself. Just acceptance. I nodded slowly. Not because I agreed, because I was trying to stay calm. My mother suddenly looked uncomfortable, as though she was beginning to realize how strange the situation sounded out loud. Before either of us could continue, my aunt walked into the kitchen carrying a serving bowl. The conversation ended immediately, but the damage was done. I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the afternoon. Every interaction suddenly looked different. Every awkward conversation, every forgotten invitation, every strange comment. What if they weren't isolated incidents? What if they were connected? As the evening went on, I started paying attention, really paying attention. And once I did, I noticed something. Natalie always seemed to know things. Not ordinary things, personal things, family, opinions, private conversations, information that somehow traveled through her before reaching everyone else. At one point, I watched her speaking with my mother in the hallway. A few minutes later, my mother approached me with advice I had never asked for. Later, Natalie spoke privately with one of our cousins. An hour after that, the cousin asked me a question based on an assumption I had never made. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice unless you were looking for it, but now I was looking, and suddenly I couldn't stop seeing it. By the end of the night, I left Thanksgiving with a knot in my stomach, not because I had proof. I didn't, not yet. What I had was something more uncomfortable: suspicion. And suspicion is dangerous, because once it starts growing, everything becomes evidence. Everything becomes a clue. Everything becomes a question. Over the next few weeks, I tried convincing myself I was overreacting. Maybe Natalie had misunderstood something. Maybe my mother remembered the conversation incorrectly. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. I wanted there to be one. Then Christmas planning started, and my hopes disappeared. One evening, my cousin Megan called me. We chatted casually for a few minutes before she suddenly asked, "Are you coming this year?" I frowned. "Coming where?" Silence. Then, Christmas. My stomach dropped. I hadn't received any information about Christmas. None. No invitation, no group message, nothing. Megan sounded confused. "Aren't you staying home?" "No." Another pause, then she said something that made my pulse quicken. "That's weird." I sat upright. "What is?" "Megan told everyone you weren't interested." I froze. "Megan?" My cousin immediately corrected herself. "Sorry, Natalie." There it was again. Natalie, always Natalie. I felt a wave of frustration rise inside me, not explosive anger, something colder, more controlled, because patterns were becoming harder to ignore. And this pattern had a name. After ending the call, I sat quietly for several minutes, thinking, reviewing, connecting dots. Then I did something I should have done months earlier. I started writing things down. Every incident I could remember, every strange misunderstanding, every missing invitation, every false assumption, every time someone referenced something I supposedly said. At first, the list seemed short. Then it grew and grew and grew. By the time I finished, I was staring at 2 pages of notes. 2 pages, not isolated events, not coincidences. Pattern. One that stretched back nearly a year, and every road seemed to lead back to the same person. Natalie. I looked at the list again, then at my phone for a long time. I debated calling her immediately, confronting her, directly demanding answers, but something stopped me, because if she really had been manipulating conversations, if she really had been shaping people's perceptions, then a direct confrontation would only warn her. No, I needed facts first, not assumptions, not emotions, facts. And for the first time, I began wondering something I had avoided asking before. Not whether Natalie was doing it, but why? Because there had to be a reason. People don't spend months quietly damaging someone's relationships without one. The question was, what exactly was my sister gaining from it? A week later, an accidental text message landed in my phone from the wrong family group chat, and what I read finally gave me my first piece of real evidence. The message appeared on my screen without warning. I was sitting in my room, half working, half scrolling through emails, when my phone buzzed. A family group chat notification popped up, except it wasn't my usual one. It was another thread. One I didn't even know I was part of. I stared at it for a second, then opened it. The first message was from my aunt. We should be careful how we explain things to her. She takes everything personally. My stomach tightened. I scrolled up. Older messages loaded slowly, and as they did, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't a casual chat. It wasn't planning. It was discussion about me. I kept reading. My uncle had replied, "Natalie says she's been distant for a while anyway." Natalie, again, always Always Natalie. My fingers went cold. I scrolled further. Another message from my mother. I just don't want things to turn into another argument like last time. Last time? What last time? I didn't remember any major argument that involved the whole family. Then I saw it. A message that made me stop breathing for a moment. From Natalie. Honestly, she's been misunderstanding most things lately. It might be better if we don't involve her directly in planning anymore. I stared at the screen, reading it once, then again, then a third time, because I wanted to believe I was misunderstanding it, but I wasn't. That was my sister talking about me to the rest of my family. As if I was unstable or difficult or unreliable, my chest tightened. I kept scrolling. Hands slightly shaking now. My father's name appeared next. Let's not make assumptions. We should still hear her side. For a moment, I felt a small sense of relief. At least someone was questioning it, but it didn't last long. Natalie responded almost immediately. Dad, I'm just telling you what I've observed. She gets defensive quickly when questioned. Observed. Not feelings, not opinions, observations, like she had been studying me, tracking me, documenting me. I leaned back in my chair. Mine tried to rationalize it. Maybe she misunderstood me. Maybe she thought she was helping. But the tone of the messages didn't feel like confusion. It felt intentional, structured, controlled. Then I saw something that made everything worse. A message from my mother. Natalie has been very involved in helping us communicate better with her lately. I stopped, read it again. Very involved. Helping us communicate better with her, with me. My throat went dry. So this wasn't just casual talk. It wasn't siblings sharing opinions. It was influence. My sister wasn't just speaking about me. She was shaping how others spoke to me, and I had been completely unaware. I scrolled further down, faster now. There were more messages, smaller ones, fragments, but all of them painted the same picture. Natalie relaying things I had never said. Family members reacting to those statements. Decisions being made based on them. Adjustments to plans. Adjustments to expectations. Adjustments to how people treated me. I felt something settle in my chest, heavy cold, because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a system one I had been excluded from completely. I closed the chat, my hands stayed on my phone for a long time. I didn't know what to feel. First, anger, shock, or something. Worse, betrayal, because this wasn't just about words being twisted. It was about trust being redirected, and I had been the only one not in the room. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the messages again. The phrases repeated in my head. She takes everything. Personally, she's been distant. She gets defensive. Words that didn't describe me, but were now attached to me. I started thinking back through the past year. Every awkward family interaction suddenly made sense. In a new way. Not as isolated misunderstandings, but as consequences of something already decided. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her immediately. Not yet. If I did that now, it would turn into a denial versus accusation situation, and I already knew how those ended in families like mine. I needed something stronger, something undeniable. So I started paying attention more carefully. Not emotionally, logically. Every conversation, every group message, every time someone referenced something I said, I wrote it down, and within days, a pattern became impossible to ignore. Natalie didn't just share opinions, she framed conversations, she guided conclusions. She repeated selective versions of events until they became accepted truth, and the scariest part, no one questioned her because she was the one who always knew what was going on. She sounded helpful, she sounded involved, she sounded reliable, which made her version of me more believable than me. And that realization hit harder than anything else so far, because it meant I wasn't just being misunderstood, I was being replaced, not physically, but narratively. My place in my own family conversations was being slowly overwritten by someone else. And the worst part, they didn't even realize it was happening. At least not yet. By the end of the week, I had enough. Screenshots, messages, patterns, evidence, not emotional assumptions, actual records. And for the first time since this started, I felt something new. Clarity, because now I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't reacting, I was preparing, and I knew exactly who I needed to talk to next. Natalie. When I finally confronted my sister with the messages, she didn't deny anything. But what she said next made me question whether she was manipulating me or protecting me from something I still didn't understand. I didn't call Natalie right away. I waited 2 days. Not because I was unsure anymore, but because I wanted to be calm when I did it. If I went in emotional, she would twist it. That much I already understood, so I planned it carefully. Sunday evening, quiet time, no distractions. When I finally pressed call, my hand didn't even shake anymore. She picked up on the third ring. "Hey," she said, like everything was normal. That alone irritated me. "Hi," I replied. "We need to talk." A short pause. Her tone shifted slightly. "What about?" I didn't waste time. I saw the group chat. Silence. Not long, but noticeable. Then she said, "Which one?" That question alone told me everything I needed to know. There was more than one. I tightened my grip on the phone. "The one where you've been talking about me to the family." Another pause. "This one?" Longer. Then she let out a small sigh. "Okay, just that." No denial, no confusion, just, "Okay." I stood up and started pacing. "So it's true?" "No," she said quickly. "Not the way you think." That phrase again. "Not the way you think." People only say that when they know things look bad from the outside. "Then explain it," I said. Natalie hesitated. For the first time, she didn't sound confident. "I didn't lie about you. you, she said carefully. I just clarified things. Clarified? I repeated. Yes, I laughed once, sharp and short. You told them I'm difficult, that I'm distant, that I get defensive. Another pause. Then she said something that caught me off guard. I told them what was happening. I stopped walking. What does that mean? Her voice softened. It means I was the only one paying attention. That answer didn't sit right. Attention to what? There was a longer silence now. Then she said, to how they were treating you. I frowned. That doesn't make sense. It does, she replied. You just don't see it yet. I sat down slowly. The confidence in her voice was unsettling. Not because it sounded manipulative, because it sounded convinced. You've been telling them I'm unstable, I said. No, she said immediately. I've been telling them you're overwhelmed. That distinction mattered to her, apparently. But to me, it felt like damage control. So why not talk to me directly? I asked. A pause. Then she said something I didn't expect. Because you don't listen when it comes from family. That hit a nerve. What? You shut down, she continued. Every time someone tries to talk to you about expectations, you pull away. I saw it happen for years. I felt my jaw tighten. That's not true. It is, she said calmly. You just don't realize how it looks from the outside. From the outside. That phrase again. Everyone kept talking about me like I was something being observed, not someone participating in the conversation. I stood up again. So instead of talking to me, you decided to talk for me? Silence. Then, I tried talking to you. When? Multiple times, she said. But you always dismissed it. I searched my memory. Nothing stood out. No direct confrontation. No serious discussion like she was describing. Only small comments. Hints. Suggestions. Never anything clear. I don't remember that, I said honestly. Natalie sighed. That's exactly what I mean. Now I was getting frustrated. You're saying I erase conversations? I'm saying you minimize them, she replied. That wording again. Carefully chosen, controlled. I walked over to the window and looked outside. My reflection stared back at me, and for a moment, I felt something uncomfortable. Not certainty anymore, but confusion creeping in, because Natalie wasn't reacting like someone caught lying. She was reacting like someone defending a belief. I saw the messages, I said quietly. You were shaping how they see me. I was protecting you, she replied immediately. That sentence landed heavily. Protecting. Always protection. Everyone in this family used that word like it justified everything. You don't need protection from your own family, I said. A long pause. Then Natalie said something that made my stomach drop slightly. You do when they stop hearing you. I sat back down, because for a moment I didn't have a response. Not because I agreed, but because the way she said it didn't sound like manipulation. It sounded like conviction, like she truly believed something was wrong, something I wasn't seeing. And that's when the conversation started shifting, because now I wasn't just trying to prove she was lying. I was trying to understand whether she genuinely thought she was helping, or whether she had been building a version of reality that only made sense to her. Natalie, I said slowly, what exactly are you protecting me from? Another pause, this one longer than all the others. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, from being expected to carry everything alone again. I frowned. What does that even mean? But she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she said something else, something that changed the direction of everything. You really don't remember, do you? My pulse slowed. Remember what? Silence. Then, what happened before all of this started? I froze, because that sentence suggested something I had never considered, that this didn't start with messages, or misunderstandings, or group chats, that there was something before all of it, something I had either forgotten or never understood properly in the first place. And suddenly, I wasn't sure which one was worse. After that call, I started digging into old family records and messages, and what I found from 2 years ago completely changed my understanding of my sister's behavior. After the call with Natalie, I didn't sleep properly. Her last question kept looping in my head. You really don't remember, do you? It wasn't said like a threat. It wasn't even said like an accusation. It sounded like she genuinely believed I was missing something important. That's what unsettled me the most. Because if she was right, then this didn't start with manipulation. It started with something I couldn't see anymore. The next morning, I did something I should have done earlier. I went back through everything, not just recent messages, old ones, very old ones, emails, chats, photos, anything I had ignored or forgotten. At first, it felt pointless. Normal family updates, birthday messages, holiday planning, nothing unusual. Then I started noticing gaps, long stretches where I barely communicated with the family. Not because I was avoiding them, but because I had been busy with work or travel or deadlines. 2 years ago especially stood out. That was the period Natalie had hinted at. I kept digging, and then I found it. A long email thread from my father. Subject line, family situation update. I frowned immediately. I didn't remember this. I opened it. The first message was from my father, sent almost 2 years earlier. He wrote about stress in the family, about how responsibilities were becoming uneven, about how everyone was feeling overwhelmed. Then I saw my name. My chest tightened slightly. My father had written, "We need to talk to her about expectations going forward. She keeps taking on too much without letting others step in." I paused. That didn't sound like a complaint. It sounded like concern. I kept reading. My mother replied, "She won't slow down unless someone intervenes." That sentence made me uncomfortable. Intervenes, like I was a problem to be managed. Then I saw Natalie's name. I hesitated before opening her message. It was longer than the others. Much longer. She wrote, "I think you're both missing the pattern. She only takes responsibility when she feels like no one else will. Then she resents it later." I frowned. That didn't didn't feel accurate, but it was confident, certain, like she had been observing something consistently. The thread continued. My father responded, "So what do we do?" Natalie replied almost immediately, "We need to start limiting what we ask her to handle. Otherwise she'll burn out again." Burn out again. That phrase stuck in my mind. Again. As if this wasn't the first time. I scrolled further. Another message from my mother. "She won't like that. Natalie, she doesn't have to like it. She has to rest." I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't what I expected. There was no hostility, no manipulation that I could immediately point to. On the surface, it looked like concern, but something about it still felt wrong. Not in the words themselves, in the outcome. Because if this was about protecting me, why did it feel like I was the only one not included in the conversation? I kept reading. The next message from my father changed everything slightly. "We should talk to her directly." Natalie responded, "We already have." She brushes it off. My stomach tightened. That again? You don't listen. You brush things off. You don't understand. The same narrative was forming again, but this time I was seeing its origin, or at least part of it. I closed the laptop for a moment and stared at the wall, trying to make sense of it, because now I had two versions. On one hand, Natalie looked like she was trying to protect me from overburdening myself. On the other hand, those same concerns had evolved into assumptions about my personality. And those assumptions had clearly shaped how my parents treated me. But something still didn't add up. If this was about protecting me, why did it escalate into isolation? Why did it turn into people speaking about me instead of to me? I reopened the laptop and kept scrolling. Then I found a message from my father I had missed earlier. It was short, just one line. "We need to be careful not to lose her like last time." I froze. Last time. Again, that phrase. Now it wasn't just Natalie mentioning it. My father had said it too. I searched the thread for context. A few messages above, I found it. Natalie had written, "After what happened before, she might withdraw again if we push too hard." My breath slowed. Withdraw again. Something had happened before this pattern started. Something I either didn't fully understand or had completely minimized in my memory. I sat there for a long time. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I started going through old personal notes, photos from that period, messages with friends, anything that could explain what last time meant. At first, nothing stood out. Then I found it. A gap. Almost 6 months where my communication with family had dropped significantly. I remembered being busy, work pressure, a major project, but now I started wondering if there was more to it. I searched deeper, and eventually I found a message from my mother during that time. Just one line. "We're glad you're talking to us again." Again. That word hit harder than anything else so far, because it implied I had stopped before. Not once, but more than once. And suddenly, Natalie's words from the phone call echoed differently. "You don't realize how it looks from the outside." I closed the laptop. My hands felt slightly cold, because now I wasn't just dealing with misunderstandings. I was dealing with memory gaps, perception differences, and a version of events that didn't fully match my own recollection. And that raised a much more uncomfortable question. Was Natalie changing how people saw me, or was she reacting to something I had never fully recognized in myself? I didn't have an answer. Not yet, but for the first time I understood something clearly. This wasn't just about control or protection or manipulation. It was about perspective, and mine was no longer the only one in question. That night, I met my parents again to finally confront everything I had discovered. But halfway through the conversation, my mother revealed something from 2 years ago that I had completely forgotten, and it explained why Natalie had started intervening in the first place. I didn't go to my parents' house that night fully prepared. I thought I was, but I wasn't. Because I went in expecting a confrontation. What I didn't expect was doubt creeping in before I even spoke. My mother opened the door and immediately noticed my expression. "Everything okay?" she asked. I nodded once, but I didn't believe it myself. Dinner was already set when I arrived, even though I hadn't said I'd eat. That small detail should have comforted me. Instead, it felt rehearsed. My father was quiet from the beginning. Natalie wasn't there yet, which made the silence even more noticeable. We sat down. No one touched the food immediately. Then I spoke. I saw the emails. My father's fork paused mid-air. My mother slowly put her glass down. Neither of them asked which emails. They already knew. That alone told me I was finally on the right track. "I want to understand what happened 2 years ago," I said. My mother looked at my father. A long pause followed. Then she sighed. "I didn't think we would ever have to go back to that." That sentence made my stomach tighten. "Go back to what?" She hesitated, then spoke carefully. "There was a period where you weren't really yourself." I frowned. "That's not true." My mother shook her head slightly. "I don't mean it like that." My father finally spoke. "You were under a lot of pressure at work." I nodded slowly. "That's normal." "Yes," he said. "But you stopped communicating with us properly for a while." I paused. That part I remembered, but not the way they were describing it. "I was busy," I said. My mother responded quickly. "You were distant." That word again. Distant. It was starting to feel like a label that had been attached to me long before Natalie ever started speaking. For me, I leaned forward. "So what does that have to do with her interfering?" My mother took a deep breath because she was the one who noticed first. I blinked. That wasn't what I expected. "She noticed what?" I asked. My father answered this time. "That you were isolating yourself." I shook my head immediately. I wasn't isolating myself, but even as I said it, I felt something uncomfortable because I did remember that period. Long work hours late, replies skipped, family calls. I hadn't thought of it as isolation, just workload my mother continued. Natalie got worried. I frowned. So, instead of talking to me directly, she tried, my father interrupted. A pause. She said you didn't respond the same way. I sat back. That part was harder to argue, because I did remember brushing off some conversations during that time, not intentionally, just being exhausted. My mother looked down. She thought you were slipping away from the family. Those words hung in the air. Slipping away. It sounded dramatic, but I also remembered how persistent Natalie had become around that time. More messages, more calls, more checking in. At the time, I had found it a bit overwhelming. Now I wasn't sure what to think. I spoke again. So she started telling people things about me? My father shook his head. Not at first. He paused. First, she tried to support you. I frowned. Support me how? My mother answered. She started updating us so we wouldn't pressure you. That sounded familiar now, too. Familiar, Natalie framing things, saying I was overwhelmed, telling others not to burden me. At the time, it might have felt like help, but now I could see how easily that could shift things. Because once people start hearing about you instead of from you, the story stops belonging to you. I rubbed my forehead. So when did it change? My father hesitated. That hesitation again. Then he said quietly, when we started trusting her updates more than your silence, not words, not lies, silence, that was the turning point. I felt something sink inside me, because that meant this didn't start with manipulation. It started with absence. My absence, my mother continued softly. She was consistent. That word mattered. She kept us informed. When we weren't hearing from you, she said, she made sure we knew you were okay. I stared at the table, trying to process it, because from their perspective, Natalie wasn't interfering. She was filling a gap, but that still didn't explain how it escalated into distorted perceptions, as if reading my thoughts. My father added, but over time, the information started shaping opinions. I looked up. What kind of opinions? My mother hesitated, then said something that hit harder than anything so far, that you handle things alone, but not always in a healthy way. I froze, because that wasn't entirely unfair. There were times I did shut down, times I didn't ask for help, times I carried things internally, but hearing it like this made it feel like a diagnosis, not a concern, a conclusion. My father leaned forward. Natalie said she thought you needed structure, not pressure. I let out a slow breath, so she started managing how you saw me. He didn't deny it. Instead, he said, she thought she was protecting you from being misunderstood. That phrase again, protecting, always protection. I sat there quietly, because now I could see both sides more clearly. On one hand, a sister worried about distance. On the other, a system slowly forming around that worry. A system where updates replaced conversations, assumptions replaced questions, and narratives replaced reality. Then my mother said something. Quieter. There's something you should know. I looked up immediately. She hesitated, then continued. After that period, Natalie was the one who pushed us to reconnect with you properly again. I frowned. What do you mean? My father answered. She suggested we invite you more, check in more, be present again. That confused me. So she fixed it? My mother shook her head slightly. No. A pause. She tried to. Another pause. But by then, we were already relying on her version of communication. The room went quiet, because that was the real turning point. Not manipulation, not lies, reliance. Once people start relying on a filtered version of someone, the direct version stops feeling familiar. I leaned back slowly, and for the first time, I didn't feel angry at Natalie or my parents. Felt something more complicated, because no, I wasn't just asking why this happened, I was asking how it became normal, and that question didn't have a simple answer. Later that night, Natalie finally arrived at the house unexpectedly, and when she walked in and saw me sitting there, she said one sentence that made me realize she had been aware of everything the entire time. The front door opened just as I was trying to make sense of everything. My parents had told me Natalie walked in like it was a normal evening. No hesitation, no warning. She froze the moment she saw me. That pause was small, but I caught it instantly. For the first time since this started, she didn't look prepared. Hey, she said carefully. Didn't answer right away, neither did my parents. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Then, she slowly stepped inside and closed the door behind her. I didn't know you'd be here, she added. I finally spoke. I wasn't sure I'd be here either. Her eyes flicked. Between me and our parents, something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, not fear, more like calculation. Like she was quickly assessing what version of the situation she was walking into. My father cleared his throat. We were just talking. Natalie nodded. About what? No one answered immediately. That alone told her. Enough. She looked at me again. Then she said something that changed the entire tone of the room. So you finally saw the old messages. It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. My stomach tightened. Mother straightened slightly. You knew about those? She asked. Natalie didn't hesitate. Yes. That single word landed heavily because it meant she hadn't been guessing. She hadn't been unaware. She had known those conversations existed, and she still walked in without warning. I leaned forward slightly. You knew and didn't. Think it was important to mention? Natalie looked at me calmly. I knew because I helped organize them. My father frowned immediately. Organize? She nodded. Yes, I kept track of updates so things didn't get misunderstood. I let out a short breath. Misunderstood by who? She looked directly at me. Everyone. That answer should have sounded defensive. Instead, it sounded certain, almost rehearsed. My mother spoke quietly. Natalie, we were just talking about how things changed. After that period, Natalie nodded again. I know. Then she looked at me and said something I wasn't prepared for. That's why I started writing things down. The room went quiet again. My chest tightened. You wrote things down? I asked. She nodded. Yes, about me. Yes. My father looked uncomfortable now. What kind of things? Natalie didn't break eye contact with me. Patterns. That word again. Patterns. I felt my frustration rise. What patterns? She finally sat down, like she was settling into something she had been holding for a long time, not replying for days, canceling calls, overcommitting, then disappearing. Shook my head. That's not what was happening. She tilted her head slightly. It is from the outside there. It was again the outside perspective, the same framing she had used before. I leaned forward. So you decided to explain me to everyone? Natalie shook her head. I decided to prevent misunderstandings. My mother interjected softly, but it ended up creating more confusion. Natalie paused. For the first time, she didn't respond immediately. Then she said, because no one had the full picture. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You mean your picture? I said. She didn't deny it. Instead, she replied calmly, I mean, the only consistent one. That sentence hit differently because she believed it fully, not as a defense, as a fact. My father finally spoke. Natalie, we need to understand something clearly. She turned to him. He continued carefully. Were you trying to explain her or replace her voice? That question hung in the air. Natalie didn't answer right away. For a moment, I thought she might finally hesitate, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. I was trying to make sure she wasn't misunderstood when she wasn't there to explain herself. I frowned, but I was there, I said. Her eyes shifted to me. You were physically there, she said quietly. That distinction mattered to her, apparently more than anything else. I felt my patience slipping, so every time I didn't respond immediately. You filled in the gaps? Natalie nodded. Yes. And those gaps became my personality? A pause. Then, they became a pattern. I stood up slightly. That's not how people work. Natalie didn't react strongly. She just said, it's how families interpret. Silence, that word again. I looked at my parents. They weren't interrupting. They were watching, listening, processing, which meant this wasn't just between me and Natalie anymore. It had always involved all of them. I turned back to her. So what exactly? Do you think I am? That question finally made her pause. Not long, but enough. Then she said something that surprised me. I think you're someone who carries too much alone until it becomes overwhelming. There was no anger in her voice. No manipulation, just certainty. Frowned. That doesn't sound like something you'd describe negatively. It isn't negative, she said. It's just risky. My mother looked confused now. Risky? Natalie nodded. If no one steps in, she burns out and disappears for weeks. That's what happened before. My chest tightened slightly because that part I couldn't fully deny. There had been periods where I withdrew, not intentionally, but because I was overwhelmed. Still, the way she framed it made it sound like I was unpredictable. Not just busy, not just stressed, unreliable. I exhaled slowly. So your solution was to manage how people see me? Natalie finally looked away for a moment, then said quietly, my solution was to keep people from misreading you. My father leaned forward. But did you consider asking her directly first? A long pause. Then Natalie answered honestly, I did. I looked at her sharply. When? She met my gaze again. Before all of this got complicated. That didn't help. It only made things worse because now I had to consider something I didn't want to. That maybe this didn't start as control. Maybe it started as concern, and somewhere along the way, it became something else entirely. My mother spoke gently. Natalie, do you see how this affected her? Natalie nodded immediately. Yes, no hesitation. That surprised me. Then she added, that's why I stopped when I realized it wasn't helping anymore. I frowned. Stopped? She looked at me. Yes. I felt my pulse slow slightly. When? Natalie didn't answer immediately. Then she said, after you started confronting the family. A pause. And after I saw you reading the messages, my stomach tightened. So, you knew I found out? She nodded. Yes, that was the moment everything shifted. Again, because now I understood something important. She hadn't been unaware. She hadn't been guessing. She had been observing the entire time, and she chose not to step away until I discovered it myself, which meant this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was a long-running system of perception, silence, and intervention, and I still didn't know whether it was built out of care or control that slowly convinced itself it was care. After Natalie admitted she stopped only after I found the messages, I asked one final question, and her answer forced me to confront something I wasn't ready to accept about my own behavior in the family. The room stayed quiet after Natalie's last statement. No one moved immediately. It felt like everyone was waiting for the next word to decide what this conversation actually was. A confrontation, a confession, or something in between. I finally broke the silence. If you stopped after I found the messages, what does that make everything before it? Natalie didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at me. Context, she said simply. That word landed heavily. I shook my head. That's not an answer. It is, she replied, still calm. It just isn't the one you want. My father leaned forward slightly. Natalie, try to be clearer. She nodded once, then exhaled. I didn't start by changing anything, she said. I started by explaining what was already happening. I frowned. What was already happening? She looked at me directly. You disappearing without explanation. You shutting down during family conversations. You not responding for days, sometimes weeks. I felt a small sting of recognition because some of that was true, but not in the way she was framing it. I was overwhelmed, I said quietly. Natalie nodded. I know. That surprised me. Then she continued, but no one else knew that at the time. They only saw distance. My mother shifted in her seat. My father stayed silent, watching both of us carefully. Natalie's voice softened slightly, so I filled in the gaps so they wouldn't assume the worst. I let out a slow breath. And what was the worst, according to you? She didn't hesitate. That you didn't care anymore. That answer hit differently because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. It was simple, and it made sense from her perspective. Sat back slowly. So you were trying to protect my image, Natalie nodded. Yes, but you ended up changing it. A pause. Then she replied, I shaped it based on what I believed was already true. That distinction mattered to her. I could hear it, but I also knew what it meant in practice because belief still affects outcomes. My mother finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. Natalie, do you realize how much influence that gave you over how we saw her? Natalie nodded again. I do. That surprised me more than anything else because she wasn't denying it. She wasn't avoiding it. She was acknowledging it, but she still didn't look regretful in the way I expected. I leaned forward slightly. So you understood you were shaping how my own family perceived me. Yes, and you still did it. Natalie paused, then said something I didn't expect because you weren't there to do it yourself. Silence. That one sentence changed the air in the room again. My father finally spoke. That's not the same as replacing her. Voice. Natalie turned to him. I didn't replace it, she said. I compensated for its absence. I felt something tighten in my chest. Absence? I repeated. Natalie looked back at me. You weren't emotionally present for long stretches of time, she said carefully. And when you were, you didn't talk about what was actually going on. I shook my head slightly. That doesn't mean I gave you permission to speak for me. Natalie nodded once. I know. A pause. Then she added quietly, I just didn't want them to misunderstand you the way I thought I was seeing you get misunderstood. That sentence hung there, longer than the others because it sounded like care, but it also sounded like certainty without consent. My mother looked between us. This got out of hand, she said softly. Natalie didn't argue. I agree. That was the first clear admission she had made. Not about intent, about outcome. My father exhaled slowly. So, where does that leave us? No one answered immediately because that was the real question now. Not what happened, but what it meant moving forward. I stood up slightly and walked toward the window again. Outside, the street looked normal, people moving through their lives without knowing any of this existed. I spoke without turning around. I want something clear. Behind me, I could feel everyone's attention shift. I don't want anyone speaking about me in my absence anymore. No one interrupted. I continued. If there's a problem, you talk to me. Not around me. Not about me. To me, I turned back. My voice was steady. That's not negotiable. Natalie nodded slowly. I understand. My parents both nodded as well. I looked at her again. And you stop interpreting silence as a decision about my life. That one made her pause. But she eventually nodded. Again. Okay, it wasn't dramatic. No apologies, no emotional breakdown, just agreement. But something had shifted. Because for the first time, the system that had formed around me was being acknowledged by everyone in the room. Not just one perspective. Not just one version of events. All of it. My father spoke carefully. So what happens now? I thought about that for a moment. Not the past, not the explanations, but forward. I think we start over, I said. My mother exhaled softly. Natalie didn't respond immediately. Then she said, I don't want to lose connection with you. I looked at her for a moment, and for the first time, I believed that part was true, but I also understood something else now. Good intentions don't always prevent harm, and awareness doesn't automatically undo impact. Nodded once. Then we do it differently. Pause. Directly. No one disagreed. Not this time. Because finally, for the first time in a long while, nothing was being assumed. Everything was being said, clearly, openly, to the right person. Months later, I thought things had settled, until I discovered one final message thread from Natalie that revealed she hadn't fully stopped after all. She had just changed how she was doing it.